Good Wednesday morning. This is interesting. I'm going to go to Romans now. Okay, he says, brothers and sisters, sin must not reign over your mortal bodies, so that you obey their desires, and do not present the parts of your bodies to sin as weapons for wickedness, but present yourself to God as raised from the dead to life, and the parts of your bodies to God as weapons of righteousness. For sin is not to have any power over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we're not under the law, but under grace? Of course not. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that although you were once slaves of sin, you have become obedient from the heart to the pattern of teaching to which you were entrusted. Freed from sin, you have become slaves of righteousness. What St. Paul's doing, he's putting religious language, which basically, it's not surprising he's saying that to the Romans, because that's basically Greek virtue. So Aristotle could have said something the same way, but he would have put it in terms of virtue, not in terms of sin. And what he's saying is it all depends on whether you live a virtuous life in the habits of virtue, what they call the habits of the heart, or you live in vice. Because the more you live in vice, the more difficult it is for you to live a righteous life. The more you live righteously, that is, you live morally, virtuously, the easier it is for you to overcome other things, problems. You have the facilities. You have the habits. God, I'm doing a terrible job here. The habits to live a fruitful, self-fulfilling life. That's Aristotle. I was just teaching that this morning. That's why it's in my mind, you see? And in the time we were growing, the time we were little children, we are taught the virtues by our parents. We're taught by example. We're taught by teaching. But from the very beginning, so that we not only know what is good and right and proper in our behavior, but we feel it. It's not just cognitive where you know it. Oh, I know I'm not so beat up with my sister. But you feel the terror. You feel bad when you do treat your sister poorly. You get it? I'm thinking a little boy and girl growing up together. I don't know. You see, you learn through the practice and the community of and the virtues of your community. You learn what it is to be truly human and to live a good human life. What Aristotle said, to flourish, to be happy. And here, St. Paul puts it in religious terms with huge eternal implications, where Aristotle didn't know that, but St. Paul does. And it's still the basic same teaching. It's righteousness begets righteousness. Vice begets vice. And we, under God's grace, we get to choose, but we still have to choose what mode of life we are going to live. If you choose to live a life that is selfish and self-preoccupied, it's difficult to overcome that later on in life. You become more and more habituated to look after your own self-interest as opposed to the interest of another. Yesterday, when I used that example of seeing the other, if what you're actually seeing when you're seeing the other is a sense of mirror, you're only seeing what's in it for you, the mirror, you'll never be intimately close to anyone anyway, because you're only intimate with yourself, and that isn't intimacy. That's pure stagnation. That's vice, you see? But if you, from the time you're little, you learn to see your sisters and brothers and parents and aunts and uncles with love, then the habit of loving, of active fidelity in loving, when you try to be nice, you try to be good, for the sake of being good, okay, and for the sake of those you love, when you look forward to giving Christmas presents rather than seeing it as an obligation, then those virtues increase and increase and increase. If you see the other way around, you get more and more isolated with life, and that's a hellish way of life. Anybody in the pastoral ministry like I am, part-time, but been in it 54 years, you see virtue and vice, you see generosity, you see loving parents, you see loving spouses. You see it, you see care. You see spouses, especially some of the most powerful spouses, caring for each other in their elderly years. I saw it in my own parents, but I see it all over the place. There's something tenderly beautiful about it. Tenderly beautiful. They're no longer Mr. Macho, and she's no longer the cheerleader. She's beautiful in his eyes, and he is beautiful in hers. Even in a nursing home. I asked a fellow one time, he was an old man, about his wife. That's about 50 years ago, I must say. I was really stupid and naive. I was a priest, though, at the time. Just ordained, I think. I said, hey, was your wife beautiful? That's a stupid question. He said to me, the woman you love is always beautiful in your eyes. See? Not neat? See? And you see that play out in life. You see how the virtues, the virtues come through. Because you practice loving imperfectly, but you still practice it. And the other person is central to your life. I told you the story 812 times, or 13 times, how my mother took care of my father, even when he didn't know her. When he was so senile, he thought she was a waitress. And every day she took a bus across New Haven in the wintertime to be with my father, who didn't know her. I told you this. I can't remember if I tell you these things, or I said it in a homily, or I said it to my students. I can't remember. I'm senile. But I don't know. But I remember I was with my mother one Christmas. My father was in a nursing home, and she said to him, Tarquino Ticonoshine, Tarquin, do you know me? No. You're to a spouse. I'm your wife. Oh, te vecchia. Wife, you're an old lady. My mother laughed so hard, when she peed in her pants, she was laughing so hard. Te vecchia, you're an old woman. I think I told you that already, that story. My mother was so faithful to my father. He didn't even know her. He didn't know her for years. He didn't know any of us. See, fidelity. My mother and father were always faithful to each other. And you see it in its total flourishing when there's no longer the distractions of busyness. And when you see the tender care of one for another. I see it in the parish all the time. How spouses care for each other in their elderly years, in their enfeeblements, how they care. That's not learned overnight. That's a lifetime expressing itself now with ease. My mother wasn't tormented or driven hard by having to take the bus every day. She did it lovingly. She never complained 1 second. Why? Because she loved what she was doing, namely being with my father, who didn't know her. I see that all over the place in the parish. It's one of the great graces. If you live old enough and in the racket that I'm in, you get to see the maturity of love itself and the intimacy of couples together. Or even how they grieve when one is lost. You know, when my father died, I thought my mother would be relieved. No longer had to cross the city and all the rest. And I said something to her. I can't quote myself because I can't remember, but I remember what she said to me. But he was still alive. She was still alive, and so she was with him, even when he didn't know her. A great sacrifice in terms of taking buses and all that, but without a complaint. If you said, boy, Ma, you really sacrificed, she would say, I did? She never thought of it in those terms. All she wanted to do was be with my father. That's not a sacrifice. That's the intimacy of love. In a form when you're both in your 80s. See? That's great. I'm very grateful for the example of my parents, both when they were younger as I knew them as a little boy, but especially when they got older, when you see the virtues reach real maturity. Sometimes you don't see that in people. They die in loneliness. That's horrible. But I was blessed to see my family and others, many, many others, as they reached the end of their lives, they reached it with the intimacy of love, a togetherness. Even when there wasn't recognition, they still saw each other and they loved each other their way.